Hello everybody, today I'll be discussing Ian Mason's text parameters in translation, transitivity, and institutional cultures. I can't exactly find a proper biography of Ian Mason. All I know is that he's a professor and director of the Center for Translation and Interpreting Studies in Scotland at Heriot-Watt University. So what does text parameter mean? Based from Collins Dictionary, parameters means limit or factors which affects the way that something can be done or made. So since we're talking about text in translation, I'm assuming it means text restriction, since it's related to the paper of Ian Mason, which is about how translators were restricted due to guidelines given by institutions. So now I'll guide you through this almost confusing paper about how institutional guidelines affect choices in translation. Organizations such as European Parliament, UNESCO, and the Federal Government of Canada. So basically, when translators translate, they were all issued guidelines from the institutions, such as style guides, codes of practice, glossaries, and so on. So Mason said it might have been because of shared experiences over the years, most especially in finding common approaches to reoccurring problems. However, the issue of institutional approaches for translation might be considered a neglected factor within the translation studies. So some translators or scholars had mentioned how these organizations had developed a culture of their own, which they also called intracultural, by pointing out the need to further research about these translational issues. So Mason asked, what do the guidelines issued by institutions affect actual translational practice in any uniform way? So basically for MOSOP, it is the goals of the institution that determine the general approach taken by translators. Customers may well ask for literal renderings, but whether or not literal renderings get produced will depend on whether the institution's doctrine of translation allows for this approach. So basically it's all about how these policies and goals from organizations are taken into the practice in the translation field, and then we will check which translator's behavior is influenced by the institution's goals or policies on translation. So the only way to measure this is to follow the guidelines. For example, if a terminology calls for a particular rendering, they shall stick to the way it's being understood or treated, regardless of the translator's own preferred style. If a translator translates, they have to check in with the institution's guidelines in order for the approach to be accepted. However, there are other text parameters worth mentioning that may reveal underlying attitude towards text and translating. So first is transitivity. Located within the ideational function pertaining to the representation of experiential meaning in the clause. So transitivity shows how speakers encode in language their mental picture of reality and how they account for their experience of the world around them. So transitivity is just how human beings present the world to them through language, and it follows that any text, both the source text and the translation text, embodies a representation of experience. So which then connects to the second text parameter, which is point of view. Closely bound to transitivity, POV is a way of looking at or thinking about something. So POV isn't restricted to just transitivity. It also involves deixis, modality, and thematicity. So just a brief definition of the terms. Deixis means words or phrases that require contextual information to convey meaning. Modality is the speaker or writer's attitude towards the world. And lastly, thematicity is something that relates to the stem of the word, like signifiers and stuff. So POV also deals with these three. However, shifts of transitivity may also change the point of view because it is, after all, based from the translator's representation of the world or their experiences. And lastly, consistent translation practice. Presentations are communication tools that can be used. Basically, there should be a consistent approach to translation. So it all kind of boils down to the previous hypothesis about how institutional doctrines affect the individual translator styles, and whether the translator behavior within the text parameter of transitivity compared to the institutional advice given to the translators. So, these are both questions that Mason would like to address. What evidence is there, if any, of a uniformity of approach across different language sections consistent with the professed aims of the institution? To what extent do actual shifts of transitivity contribute to signaling significantly different values at the level of text and discourse in translated documents? So, Mason mentioned that there's no definitive answer at the moment since the investigation reported in the paper were still too small to be able to yield reliable findings. So for most of the paper, Mason would just put forward some tentative hypotheses which would be tested against longer and broader datasets. So let's proceed to the second part of the paper, translating for institutions. So institutions like European Parliament, UNESCO, Federal Government of Canada, and other institutions that offer guidance towards the translators were being investigated. So translators who are either full-time in-house regular or freelancers can be questioned. So there were mentioned translators and scholars like Mossop, Koskinen, Monday, etc., who experienced the institutional policies given to them by said organizations. So Mossop mentioned that the Canadian federal government's translation doctrine states that one should render not the words or the structures of the source text, but rather the message, or in other words, the author's intention. So, what's being implied here is that basically the federal government prioritizes the words and structures more since they wanted to render the author's intentions or message of the source text. So mostly they care more on semantics. Meanwhile, another guideline is keeping slavishly to the expressions and in structures chosen by the author. So it's how structures make up the text and they are mostly separable from the message to be relayed in translation. Again, it kind of deviated from what the author's message is intended, since these policies will change the source text transitivity just for the interest of relaying its intention. But aside from that, Mason would further want to compare other institutional policies. One is the Canadian Translation Bureau's policy, which has the requirement of authenticity. So, the Canadian Translation Bureau mentioned that authenticity is the impression conveyed by a translation that it is not, in fact, a translation, that it was composed in the target language from the outset, that it is an original piece of writing. So this is kind of weird because apparently authenticity is the impression conveyed by a translation, not the original source text. So to compare, institutional guidelines really do restrict translators' approaches in translation, and most policies cares more on the structures of the text, because like authenticity is not the original source text but more on the impression conveyed by a translation, which is kind of contradicts the original meaning of authenticity. So next we will be focusing on two organizations, the European Parliament and the UNESCO. So Koskinen said there is a clear, albeit unwritten, preference for surface level similarity, which is assumed to guarantee that readers of the various translations all get the same message. Equivalence is often taken to mean linguistic correspondence or literal rendering. With the notion of authenticity, it is an official policy in all EU institutions that translations are not preferred to as such but rather as language versions. So it means if you translate a source text into another language, it will be called a language version, not translation, because translations are presented as if texts were drafted in all languages simultaneously, which makes it seem that source text doesn't exist. So basically, it's like the equality of languages. There are no language that's superior than the other, which is kind of weird because translation is actually translating a source text to another language. But in this case, it's called a language version. So, and then Monday reports that UNESCO has issued a set of guidelines for its translators, which has said that accuracy is the very first requirement for all translations. For periodicals, while accuracy is still the greatest importance, journal editors will insist on receiving a readable text. So it means that UNESCO prioritizes accurate translations. Organizations usually has like different translating activities that ranges in different fields, which includes documents from conferences and meetings, which has discrepancies between different languages when we translate them. So that can be like a source of problem. So mostly they are shunned. But in most cases, or like in the case of periodicals, journal editors mostly insist on readable text more than the accuracy. So majority of these organizations' advices to translators are quite traditional, since they usually use the terms accurate, idiomatic, equivalent, literal, and message. So we can really see how these institutions' requirements have conflicts with each other. So mostly the final judgment is being left to the translator. So moving on to the third part, transitivity, the evidence. So Mason repeats the earlier question: what evidence is there of uniformity of practice within institutions? So you can see that there's a table here about the uniformity of practice within institutions. So like what processes they use when translating and etc. So yeah, mostly what participants, and then okay, we're now going to focus on translations of speeches delivered by European Parliament and articles appeared in UNESCO Courier. So the first problem encountered is, given structural or systemic differences between languages, a number of shifts are obligatory and will be introduced automatically by any competent translators. So since we're focusing on the English, Spanish, and the French language from the speech and article, the problem is that since the organization prioritizes the structure, the translators would be obliged to make a lot of shifts, like translation shifts, like changes from the source text to the translated text. And it is like more likely open to a lot of translators, which will not give us an indication of their strategies or behavior. It will make it hard for us to determine their strategy when translation. So they mostly have to be filtered out. And then the second problem is the boundary between disallowed structures and those which are more or less strongly dispreferred. Technically, it's more on the limits, like on how much a translated text structure can be permitted, or the limits on the preferred translations as a translator is given. So yeah, that's it. And then the third problem is the issue of relative significance of shifts. So many had altered the sense in which a process may be viewed by the text receiver in a significant way, which will make it even difficult to define a reliable boundary between the insignificant and the rest. We're talking about how the translated text differs from one language to another. So because of these issues, quantitative analysis was abandoned at this stage in research. So the whole focus of the paper should be the translator's creativity and their limits that they themselves have imposed on, not the others. So for the fourth part, uniformity of approach, in this part, translations of the speeches to the European Parliament mostly stay close to the transitivity patterns which are observable in the source text, because the sensitivity of pronouncements by politicians, and because of the need to avoid misrepresenting not only the intended meaning but also the words that were actually spoken by them. Because of this careful procedure, the translated text would undergo numerous shifts into the translation due to idiomatic preferences. So the highest incidence of calques is found in both French and Spanish translations due to syntactic similarities of the language, because they're really the words are even like similar to each other. So calque became the default mechanism, which results to a general tendency in these translations to move further in the direction of perceived intended meanings. So if you don't know, calque means loan translations or borrowed terms. So in short, the treatment of transitivity patterns varies widely within each institution and within each language pair. So it mostly just depends. So and then the last part is a discoursal shifts. So the discoursal shifts refer as the participatory function of the language. So individual shifts may provide clues to translators' approaches to their task. So translation shifts, by the way, are changes that occur when a text is translated into another language, due to either the differences between two languages or the translator's choices in translating. So shifts concatenate and establish a trend within a text. A whole discourse may be shifted such that a different impression may be received of the source text producer's attitude or intentions. So here on the right side, we have an example of a Spanish source text. No se ha llevado a cabo la erradicación de la enfermedad, which literally translates to the eradication of the disease has not been carried out. See, literally has not carried itself out. So in the translated text, the disease has not been eradicated. If you can notice that the translated text became more direct than the source text, because English is leaning towards its importance on attenuation. So like the shifts occur in a number of different ways and may individually be of little significance, but they are mutually reinforcing in that within a text they all go in the same direction, see, towards attenuation in English and densification in French. So the discoursal shift might be related to the attenuation of the English language, meaning that English has the reduction of the force, effect, or value of the text, which the European Parliament preferred because of the increased directness of the translated text. So yeah, that's that's basically it. In conclusion, surprising degree of variation is present in both in the institution's guidelines. There is basically the European Parliament translations stay fairly close to their source text, while the UNESCO translations exhibits more freedom and more frequent incidents of shifts in transitivity. So there is then little uniformity of practice or evidence of influence of institutional guidelines on translator behavior. So there's an overriding impression that translators either adheres as closely as possible to the source text or depart from it depending on the present environment. So a further consideration is the vagueness of the guidelines issued, their inherent contradictions, and the questionable assumptions on which some concepts, authentic, accurate message, etc. are based. So basically translators have the right to have different approaches or strategies when it comes to translation. So I feel like they should not be restricted to just merely the guidelines of the institutions. And I feel like the institutions had more contradictions itself rather than the correct way of translating a text. So yeah, that's just basically the gist of the entire report. So thank you for listening.